Welcome to this series of lectures on alchemy, and we are at the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art. It's the 2019 Winter Trimester, and I'm leading a course right now on the Alchemy of Paint. So we're going to be doing a series of lectures on both alchemy and paint, which is to say the pigments, the historical pigments, and the oils and varnishes that go into painting. I'm going to begin this series of lectures with some general lectures on alchemy, and this one in particular will be an introduction to the ideas and concepts of alchemy. And we'll follow that up with a history of alchemy, as well as some of the sources of alchemy from ancient Greece and Alexandria. So to begin, the introduction to alchemy. For myself, I was introduced to alchemy as a result of this painting called Christ Alchemist, which I painted in 1997. And the painting itself came to me in a dream. And I dreamt that I saw myself as this Christ-like figure rising from the tomb with a kind of altar in front of me. And in the altar was a chalice with this vas hermeticum, we can call it, this glowing vessel, and a child within the glowing vessel. So this image intrigued me so much that I needed to paint it, and at the same time I was learning how to paint. This is before the age of the internet, so I basically had to teach myself how to paint with oils and varnishes and so forth. And this painting then became for me both an introduction to oil painting, how to go about painting in oils, as well as alchemy, because I started to investigate alchemy both as a spiritual pursuit and as a psychological pursuit. Then, in 2017, I was invited by my wife to leave Vienna and visit Prague for a weekend. So we went to Prague, and in particular there was the Alchemy Museum. And as we entered, as you can see over here on the left, the entrance itself is not too special. You just have a bunch of display cases with things for sale. But as you go through this door on the right and penetrate into the back room, you start to get a feeling that perhaps there is something very authentic about this space because of the images that appear on the walls. There are designs of earth, air, water, and fire, for example. But really, it's when you penetrate a bit deeper through this door over here and down into the cellars that you're suddenly confronted by an authentic alchemist's laboratory or dungeon. And I suddenly had a moment of awakening, a revelation that the alchemists themselves throughout history were not just these imaginary or literary figures, but were this underground stream of practicing alchemists that went all through time and even into our own present era. As I penetrated deeper into those caverns, I realized that what they were doing connected very deeply with what we're doing here at the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art, insofar as we're going after both the imagery and the historical techniques of painting and combining those two. The pursuit of the historical techniques of painting combines with the pursuit of imagery to create a new form of alchemy. So when the Academy expanded, I was also able to expand my space, and not too far from where I'm standing is my alchemical dungeon. And down there, I'm able to further my pursuits into combining varnishes and oils and essential oils to create different mediums for painting, as well as diving deeper into imagery and the alchemy of imagery. So, alchemy itself. What is alchemy? There are many possible ways to talk about alchemy, to describe alchemy, but I find the best way to describe it is using this image here from Stefan Michelsprache. It's an engraving to his work Kabbalah, Spiegel der Kunst und Natur, Alchemie. And he basically says that alchemy is a rabbit's hole. You see the alchemist on the right over here, blindfolded, because he doesn't quite know exactly what he's doing or where he's going. And then he appears a second time on the left with no blindfold, and now he's following this rabbit down into the rabbit hole. And this idea of following the white rabbit is something which after this engraving has appeared time and again in our culture. The most famous example probably being Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, where Alice herself sees a white rabbit and follows him down, and then she herself increases in size, decreases in size, meets with a hallucinogenic caterpillar, and so forth. So the white rabbit becomes this image of going deeper and deeper into this fantastic or imaginary world. This gets picked up in the psychedelic 60s, especially by, say, Jefferson Airplane and their song about Alice, Go Ask Alice When She's 10 Feet Tall, which became another important landmark in our culture of how psychedelics are also, in a certain sense, this movement down the rabbit hole. Then technology, the internet, and so forth with the Matrix, and that's another form of following the rabbit down into the rabbit hole. And as you probably know, Neo receives a message on his screen, "Wake up, Neo, the Matrix has you. Follow the white rabbit." And sure enough, knock, 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 there's a knock on his door, and this woman appears with a white rabbit on her shoulder, so he decides to follow them, and this leads him on his adventure through the Matrix. I can say that that is alchemy, a journey down the rabbit hole, but also alchemy can be a journey into darkness. And we see that in this engraving here on the left, that the alchemist penetrating into the night with only his lamp to guide him, following the footsteps of nature. And that's what the alchemist does, is try to follow in nature's footsteps and understand her way of creating metals in the earth. Another image of alchemy then being the labyrinth over here, and the alchemist has to penetrate deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. Here, the labyrinth being indicated by different symbols of the planets and the metals. And so understanding the correspondence of the metals to the planets as you go deeper to this primordial fountain that exists at the center of the labyrinth. Let's look at the word alchemy and its origins, because its origins reveal a lot about the history of alchemy. And some scholars have traced the word alchemy back to ancient Egypt. Certainly, Egypt is an important source for alchemy, along with Babylonia or Mesopotamia. In Egypt, you have this word kemet, K-M-T, from the Coptic. In the Coptic, it is keme or kemi. And Plutarch translates that word into Greek then as Kemia. Now, Kemet means the Black Land, and Egypt itself was called the Black Land because the Nile Valley was a fertile source for all of its vegetation and the cause of its creation as a civilization. And the Nile is surrounded by this rich black soil, so the Black Land being the black soil of Egypt. Then you move into Greek culture, and in Greek culture, the word chema is used, and the source of this word chema is that which is poured out, hence chemia, and that then became the art of alloying metals, chemia in ancient Greek. Zosimos, who we will meet with many times, was the first Greek-speaking alchemist who lived in Alexandria. He refers to his activities in theurgic terms. He calls it the hieratike techne, the sacred art. And we will meet with theurgy as a sacred art many times over the course of these lectures. So who uses the word chemia first? It is actually Diocletian. And Diocletian was the emperor, and he himself did not like alchemists because of the threat they posed to his kingdom, the reproduction of coins, and so forgery in a certain sense. And so he created a ban on alchemy in 296. And he described alchemy through the words saying, the ancient writings of the Egyptians, which treat of the chemia, transmutation of gold and silver. So he uses this word chemia in reference to what these people were doing in their coloring of different metals. Then alchemy shifts from Alexandria towards the Byzantine era and Constantinople, which is then overrun by the Arabs, and we have the Arabic period of alchemy, where it is called alchemia, with this definite article of al before the Greek chemia. From the Arabs, it passes over into Middle Ages of Europe, and Robert of Chester in 1144 is the first one to translate into Latin the Arabic texts, and specifically the epistle of Marianus, the hermit and philosopher, to Prince Khalid. And in that text, he talks about alchemy, and Robert of Chester says, "Since what alchemia is and what its composition is your Latin world does not know, I will explain in the present book." So he's coining this new word, alchemia, from the Arab alchemy and bringing that into the Latin language. Then it remains with us for the remainder of European history. The alchemists themselves didn't often refer to themselves as alchemists, but using other names. Often it was the ars hieratica, the sacred art, and so they practiced a sacred art. Or it was the ars magna, the great work that they were performing in their alchemical experiments, also called the spagyric art, which is to separate and recombine plant forms and so forth. And then just quite simply the hermetic art, because Hermes Trismegistus was the patron god of alchemy, and so it was a hermetic art from Hermes Trismegistus. I've taken the time now to divide up alchemy into about 11 historical periods, and in another lecture I will go through these periods one by one, but for now I just want to give you an overview. That the earliest period of alchemy is in the Near East, which is to say Egypt and Mesopotamia, and where you have the first time that metals are extracted from their ores through fire. And this gives rise to the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age and so on. So this period from 5000 to 500 BCE, before the Common Era, is the first period of alchemy. Then the classical Greeks come along, like Plato and Aristotle, and they develop Greek natural philosophy. This is not alchemy per se, but all of their concepts become very important for the history of alchemy. Alchemy itself emerges here in the third period, what's called the Greco-Egyptian chemia, and it is Greco-Egyptian because focus shifts to Alexandria, which is in Egypt, but it's a Greek-speaking culture. And this is where alchemy really emerges around 300 BCE to 300 CE in the Common Era. As I mentioned, the focus then shifts over to Constantinople in the Byzantine era of alchemy. So from 300 to 900, you have Byzantine alchemy, and then that empire is overrun by the Arabs, so that the Arab period begins. And this lasts from around 650 to 1050, and it's thanks to the Arab translations of these Byzantine texts that then get retranslated into Latin culture in the medieval period that alchemy survives. So as we saw with Robert of Chester around 1150, the Arab texts start to be translated into Latin. And you have the medieval Latin period of alchemia, which then over the early, high, and late Renaissance passes through increasing periods of interest in alchemy, so that many, many texts are published, especially, say, in Frankfurt during the High Renaissance period. Literally hundreds of alchemical texts are produced in this period. Suddenly, during the Enlightenment, which is to say the 1700s and into the 1800s, alchemy suffers a swift decline. With the rise of chemistry as a science, suddenly alchemy is discredited. Really, there are very few people who are practicing alchemy during that period. It's only in the 1900s, with the rise of psychological and scholarly chemistry, that alchemy has a resurgence. And it has a resurgence, as we'll see, in two ways, both as a form of psychology and as this object of scholarly interest. So I'll cover all of that in another lecture. but that's a basic overview. For this particular lecture, I'm going to rephrase this question, what is alchemy, by answering it in a more mystical fashion. And I'm going to say that alchemy is a mystery tradition inspired by Gnosticism and theurgy that uses the alchemical opus to reunite the spirit with divinity. Now, I'm using terms you might not be familiar with, Gnosticism and theurgy. I will explain that more carefully. But basically, the idea of reuniting spirit with divinity, that's at the heart of the Alexandrian philosophy that emerged in the first centuries of our era. And Gnosticism, theurgy, alchemy, they were all together, Neoplatonism as well, in Alexandria at that time. Let's take a more spiritual view of all of this. And I'm going to begin by explaining that our concept of vision changed fundamentally in the 1700s with Newton and his work on optics, because at that period, which was a scientific period, again, the Enlightenment, we understood vision as something that's passive, that light comes from the sun, bounces off an object, and enters our eye. And so what we see is the object and the image of the object entering our eye in the sense that vision becomes passive. Before that, and for all of history from the ancient Greeks through the Arabs to the Middle Ages, vision was understood as active. And this is called the extramission theory of vision, if you want to look it up in a scientific context. So, from ancient Greece until the early Renaissance, vision proceeds from the eye. And this is important for us as artists or alchemists, this concept of vision, because as we'll see in the subsequent images and slides, that it's a fundamental way of viewing the world. That for the artist or the alchemist, we are able to practice visionary seeing, which is to say that we open our vision to the divine eye. And the divine eye actively sees and creates the universe that surrounds it. So we have to have this concept of active vision, where vision emerges in what's called the interocular fire or flame. And from this interocular fire or flame, vision flows outward and meets the air surrounding us, the light surrounding us, and goes to the object. And in a certain sense, vision is able to create the objects that it sees. I had this insight as a result of this painting, which I mentioned earlier, Christ Alchemist. And in this painting, you have that curious image of the child in this glass vessel. I then showed this painting to Professor Ernst Fuchs of Vienna, and when he saw it, he suggested that I become an apprentice and work with him, which I did. I moved to Monaco, and I studied and worked with him as a paid assistant, learning his technique of painting, which I now transmit here at the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art. I also learned a lot about his fundamental worldview, his philosophy, his spiritual worldview. And that is best described by this image over here, which appears in the work that you see on the far right called The Battle of the Transformed Gods. And he describes this image as the Behälter des Weltalls in German, the vessel of the universe. Behälter in German means literally a vessel, but it's very similar to the English word behold. And in English, to behold is to therefore not just see, but also hold in a container. And the Behälter des Weltalls, the idea is that you have this eye at the center of the container. And the container is, in fact, the entire cosmos, the universe. And that this eye at the center is creating the cosmos that surrounds it. That is the Behälter des Weltalls. So in the same sense that this child here in the chalice, it's going to be creating the entire world around it as it grows through time. So the alchemical vessel or egg is the result of active vision, seeing and creating its surrounding universe. That's the idea I would like to suggest. and go a bit deeper into that. This brings me to the philosophical worldview of the divine I in the mirrored sphere of the cosmos. And it's basically a concept or worldview that you have to wrap your mind around. It's a mystical way of seeing the world. If you accept that vision is active, if you accept that divinity was able to create the cosmos by opening its divine eye and seeing, in the same way that God opened his mouth and spoke and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Instead, he just opened his eye, saw, and therefore created light. So, if vision is active and the divine eye creates by seeing, then we, in a certain sense, can participate in that. And that divinity itself is this oneness which creates a many-layered cosmos that's fundamentally one and unified. So what happens, and we'll see this in subsequent lectures, is that the divine one creates the cosmos, and as it does, it sees reflections of itself. It sees itself first as the Father, God the Father, but also as God the Mother, and together God the Father and the Goddess the Mother create the child, and so on, which creates humanity. And all of these are different reflections of itself in space and in time, this many-layered cosmos. But since they're all reflections of the one divinity, they remain unified at their source. So that's the philosophical worldview, which I will explain in later lectures, and it is necessary to understand the more mystical side of alchemy, because alchemy is not just experiments with sulfur and mercury and other things. It is really the creation of images, and particularly images that are mandala-like in construction, so that you can meditate on these images to get this sense of oneness with the cosmos. And we see it, for example, on this alchemical image on the left, where it says very clearly Omnia ab uno, and so you have this unity at the beginning of all time. And this unity, natura, then separates into ignis, terra, aqua, air, the four elements. But these eventually recombine through vegetabilia and mineralia, and you have omnia ad unum, which is to say the return of the many to the one. So going from the emergence of the many from the one to the return of the many to the one, omnia ab uno, omnia ad unum, this becomes a fundamental concept for alchemy. Omnia ab uno, the emergence of the many from the one. This can happen in the form of the one dividing into two, the one dividing into three, into 4, 7, 12, and so on. We see it in this mandala-like image where you have the vessel. And the vessel is at the beginning. The beginning of all things occurs in the vessel. And what happens at the beginning? You have this fundamental division of the one into two. Here you have this black triangle, which is inverted, and this red triangle, which is upward. That is a symbol of both fire and water as the two fundamental elements which are seconded by air and earth, as well as the masculine, feminine, sulfur, mercury. And then alchemy creates further divisions of the two using those images as the masculine, feminine, the king, the queen, Sol and Luna, and so on. Here, these two serpents wrapping around each other is another image of the divinity dividing into two fundamental principles. From two, you get three, and images of the three in alchemy are body, soul, and spirit, or salt, sulfur, and mercury. And indeed, in this image that you see over here, you have salt on the left, you have sulfur on the right, and you have mercury here at the bottom. So this Trinity, which for Paracelsus was the tria prima, the three fundamental principles that lie in operation in the Opus Alchemicum. Body, soul, and spirit, we'll meet with that in other slides. The black, the white, and the red is the most common phases of the alchemical opus, the colors that describe the phases of the alchemical opus, the black nigrido, the white albedo, and the red rubido. And you can see that happening at the bottom here, but now it's expanded into 4. And the 4 color stages are then the black, the white, the yellow, and the red. Other quaternities, other images of the 1 as 4 would be, of course, hot, cold, dry, moist, which are the 4 qualities which underlie the 4 elements. And the 4 elements are earth, water, air, and fire. Then come the 7, and typically there are 7 metals in alchemy and 7 metals associated with the 7 visible planets in the cosmos. These all have their symbols, and in this diagram then, this is Mercury over here, this is Venus over here, and Mars over there, and Jupiter and Saturn. With the sun and the moon, you have the 7 planets that form the correspondence with the 7 metals. 12, then the 1 divides itself not just into these 7 planets that are layers of the cosmos, but also these 12 divisions of the starry heavens. And the 12 divisions of the starry heavens, you all know, are the 12 signs of the zodiac, which then surround the 1 that is in this alchemical vessel at the center. The steps of the alchemical opus also vary. There's no constant, but in general it can be 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, even 7 steps, and sometimes 12 or more, but as symbolic numbers, and all of these condense back into the 1. So this is the Omnia ab uno, how all come from the 1 and the 1's division into 2, 3, 4, and so on. Then the all come back into unity again, and the stages of the opus help in this return to unity. In this particular diagram, which we've seen before, you have the 7 steps of the opus described as here, this pyramid with 7 steps. And it goes from calcination to sublimation to solution, putrefaction, distillation, coagulation, to the final tincture at the end. This is one interpretation of the 7 steps necessary in the opus, but it's not the only one. Again, earth, air, fire, water described on the 4 corners, the zodiac, the 12 here on the outside, the 7 planets corresponding to the 7 metals with Mercury at their top, and the phoenix as a symbol of the completion of the opus, the red stage, at the very top. So the purpose then of the opus is to gradually ascend through the 7 steps until you realize a state of oneness with the all. That's why you see this phoenix here at the center of the entire mandala. That the phoenix is that which has perished and been reborn from the ashes, and it has a fundamentally reborn view of the cosmos. And what is that rebirth? It's the understanding of the cosmos as ordered and as one. Now I would like to move on to giving you some of the basic allegories of alchemy. Already you see in this image here the Ouroboros, the serpent with its tail in its mouth, all of this transpiring within the vas hermeticum. Alchemy typically then begins with the Prima Materia, also called the Materia Prima, the first matter. And it is, again, using the Ouroboros, the serpent with its tail in its mouth, as a symbol of that matter, that substance at the beginning, which will transform. And obviously you have heard or understood that alchemy is about the transmutation of base metals into gold. This is definitely an important concept through the history of alchemy. More specifically, they're looking for the philosopher's stone. And the philosopher's stone is a kind of a tincture which will therefore be able to dye or transmute other metals into more noble metals like silver and like gold. But where do you begin? And just this question of where to begin is fundamental to so many alchemical texts. If you begin with the wrong Prima Materia, then you've taken the wrong path in your rabbit hole to the end of the gold or the philosopher's stone. The Prima Materia has many names, and these names are called by scholars deknomen, which is to say covering names. And as we saw, Diocletian had a ban on alchemy. Because alchemy was banned throughout its history, alchemists themselves had to come up with deknomen, with covering names, to hide what they were doing, to hide the processes, so only the initiated would understand what these were. So the Prima Materia itself is a kind of a deknomen, and then using these allegories, using these images like serpens or draco or monstrum for the Prima Materia, which is basically heil, let's say matter, but also sperma, the source of things, the seed, the semen mundi of all things. And it was understood as this primeva terra chaotica, this primeval chaotic earth, what you see here in the center. Because earth, air, fire, and water were not yet completely separated at the beginning of time. And so they were all in chaos, they were all intermixed. And that's what you're seeing by this image over here on the far right of this primordial chaos or abyss that was called, for example, the massa confusa, and this confusion of all. All forms hidden within the depths, the substance underlying everything. This is the Prima Materia. It is uncreated, the increatum, and also it is the root of itself, the radix ipsius. So, like divinity itself, it is the root of itself, and like divinity, it is the beginning of all, the initium omnium. There you have all these different words or images to describe that first matter, that Prima Materia. And here you see them, earth, air, fire, and water intermixed. And in fact, this is where the metals will eventually come from, as we will see, that metals themselves are a form of water that get compressed in the earth and in stone and emerge in this way. So, at one point then, in the beginning, in the creation, earth, air, fire, and water polarize into opposites, and this mandala is created. Here you have from Orance Fine de Monde Sfera that you can see ignis at the top and aqua at the bottom, so fire and water as opposite poles, and earth and air as other opposite poles. And why are these opposite? Because of their underlying qualities. And he shows you the qualities in these corners over here. Caliditas for the heat, frigiditas for the cold, siccitas for the dry, and humiditas for the moist. I've reproduced this diagram on the right over here to give you an even clearer concept of how these work. And what I'm trying to show you is that fire itself has dry and hot underlying it as its two fundamental qualities. Water, which is opposite fire, the element of water has cold and moist as its underlying qualities. Now, since cold is opposite hot and since dry is opposite moist, these qualities that they possess push them as opposite each other. And the same is true of air and earth with their underlying qualities, which are also opposites. But fire does share with air one common quality, which is to say the hot. And so the hot binds fire and air together, even as the dry and the moist push them apart to be separate elements. And this goes all the way around the wheel, that air shares with water the quality of moisture, but the hot and cold separate them, and so on around the wheel. So we have this idea then of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, in these oppositions, and the four qualities, the four underlying qualities set up in these oppositions. And this will become a fundamental structure for all of alchemy, because part of your alchemical experiment is to heat something, and by heating something, the hot will therefore influence and change the cold and change the moist. Now, if we treat this as a kind of a mandala, and you should, if it's an image that you should be able to memorize and reconstruct in your mind's eye and have you, like a mandala, that you can guide it and use it at all times. And I think it's quite simple to put fire at the top and water at the bottom. This seems very intuitive. But the earth and air on either side, this becomes less intuitive. And it's very easy to take this mandala, which is what I showed you at the beginning, and reverse it laterally so that you have now earth on the right and air on the left. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you often see many diagrams in this fashion. Why? Because if you associate the hot and the dry with the time of the year, the season, the summer, and then you want to associate the other qualities with the other seasons of the year, then autumn becomes the dry and cold period, winter becomes the cold and moist period, and spring becomes the hot and moist period, when vegetation reemerges after the cold and moist winter. So it naturally invites this clockwise movement of summer, autumn, winter, spring, and so we want to naturally put earth on the right. There's nothing wrong with that. But the reason why I've created the mandala with earth on the left and air on the right is that when you actually read Aristotle, and he's the first one to write about this, Aristotle refers to it as a cycle, and he says that fire becomes air, becomes water, becomes earth. And so in Aristotle, air is on the right, and it's doing this clockwise movement, and he's not even caring about the presence of the seasons in his description. So I'm going to be using the mandala where you have fire at the top, which is the upright triangle, and water at the bottom, which is the upside down triangle. And we also put this horizontal bar across those triangles to create air and earth. And in this case, if you imagine that here you have this upside down triangle with the bar, well, that makes an E, which is to say the earth. And then this other upright triangle with the bar across it is like the A. So you now have fire, water, and it's a little mental construct, earth and air from left to right. And I've even gone so far in my imaginings to create more symbols for the cold and hot that you see here, as well as the dry and the moist. So I can now go through this entire structure, this entire mandala, without words and only their symbolic counterparts. There's another way to look at the four elements, and that's not just in this mandala-like structure, but also as a hierarchy. And when we look at them as a hierarchy, such as you see here, then earth and water are at the bottom, and air and fire rise above them. And the division then is somewhere around here, although it's actually a four-part division. Earth being the most dense of all the elements, water being more dense, and so they therefore collect first with the earth on the bottom and then the water on top of it. The air, which is more subtle, rises up above the water, and fire in the air, fire is trying to reach even higher through the air because it is the most subtle of all. Subtlety, density, but also levity, gravity. And you have to remember, this is gravity from the period before Newton and his concepts of science. Gravity rather being the natural, the earth wants to naturally fall, wants to naturally move towards the lowest place in the cosmos where there are four elements. And air and fire want to naturally rise up, and that gives them the quality of levity or lightness. Also, Earth and water are more fixed compared to air and fire. Air, you can imagine, like smoke, being much more volatile and free, and fire being the most volatile of all. So, again, these opposites, subtle, dense, or another opposite, levity, gravity, and volatile and fixed. Now, if you look at these qualities of the hot and cold and the dry and the moist, the hot and the cold are considered to be the most active, and Aristotle will explain this in another lecture that I have later on. But basically, that's why the alchemist uses his fire to actively create change. And fire or cold are actively changing these passive qualities of the dry and the moist in our alchemical experiments. Another image or allegory which I would like to mention in alchemy, and this goes back to the Greco-Egyptian period of, say, Zosimos, is what was called the Tetrasomy. And tetra being four, somi from the Greek word soma, meaning body, so the four-body. And I mentioned the idea of the 7 planets and the 7 metals. Of the 7 metals, the 4 base metals, as they're called, are copper, iron, tin, and lead. And those 4 base metals form a kind of foundation to the alchemical experiment. And so for some alchemists, the Prima Materia was this tetrasomy, this combination of copper, lead, tin, and iron, which they called then the metal of magnesia. And you had to create an alloy of copper and lead and tin and iron. And once you had this balanced alloy of those 4 base metals, you could begin your alchemical experiment. And you're trying to eventually then elevate those 4 into these 3, which is to say mercury, which is the first of the noble metals, and then silver, and then gold. Another form of the 4 is the 4 degrees of fire, and even though this is an important idea for alchemy, not all the alchemists agreed what are the 4 degrees of fire. It's another rabbit hole, if you want, that alchemists went down. This particular version I find to be very relevant. In this version, the first degree of fire is given to us from the Balneum Mariae, or the bain-marie in French. And this construction was attributed to Maria Prophetissima, who was perhaps one of the earliest alchemists, Zosimos, who was from Alexandria, and attributed the construction of this bain-marie or double boiler to her. And basically, you have a double boiler, which is to say, you have a pot of water over the fire, and then you place a second pot inside the first so that the water heats. And that means you have a gentle, almost feminine heat, if you want, a generative heat, like the heat of the womb, because the fire will never go more than 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water. After this first degree of fire, you come to the second degree of fire, now the Balneum Cinerus, which is to say a bath, an ash bath, where the vessel is placed in these glowing ashes or in an ash pit. And obviously this is a bit higher, but it's not a full flame, it's just the glowing embers of the ashes, so it's warmer than that. The third degree of fire would be the Balneum Arena, or the sand bath, where instead of water, in the first case, you're using sand. And you're heating the sand so that it can get to a much higher temperature. The last and 4th degree of fire then is the crucible, the Balneum Ignis, the bath of fire. And this bath of fire is a direct flame, and you were trying to heat as highly as possible to, for example, free the metal from its ore, or else create a kind of an alloy between 2 metals. So 4 degrees of fire, and you also have here these different images within the vessel. You can see the serpent and the serpent's egg within the first. Here is the basilisk, which is to say a mythical beast that was part rooster, part serpent. You can see the rooster's feet over here. And the gaze of the basilisk was able to kill anyone who looked at it. The Ouroboros in this vessel over here, the serpent with its tail in its mouth. And you can also see the salamander at the very top, and the salamander was a mythical animal which was able to live and survive in fire. Just before leaving, I want to note that the 4 degrees of fire also have a hidden meaning, which is to say it may refer to the alchemist's inner spark or flame, because the alchemist was considered to be a master of fire. Mastering the degrees of fire, not just externally, but internally. And so if they could control their inner flame or inner spark, the fire and the degree to which their inner spark burns. So, moving on, we've seen earth, air, fire, and water. We've seen how those are divided into their qualities of hot and cold, or dry and moist. And Aristotle then makes a fundamental contribution to alchemy with his idea of the exhalations and the vapours. This appears in a text of his called Meteorology from 350 before the Common Era. And he basically says that we maintain there are 2 exhalations, one vaporous, the other smoky. And there correspond 2 kinds of bodies that originate in the earth: fossils, which is to say stones, and metals. The heat of the dry exhalation is the cause of all fossils, such as stones. The vaporous exhalation is the cause of all metals. So now we have this fundamental division where the dry and the hot that you saw at the top over here, that basically creates fire, well, the dry and the hot create these exhalations as well. And once these exhalations are held within the earth, they become stones. Meanwhile, the cold and the moist, which are very similar to water, once those cold and moist vapors are held within the earth, they become not stones, but metals. And here is then the beginning of metal, the understanding that metal is cold and moist. Now, dividing the cold and moist from the hot and dry will also be very important in alchemy, because the cold and moist is the mercury principle, while the hot and dry is the sulfur principle. And this is true from the Greek period of alchemy, but especially the Arab period of alchemy under Jabir. And he is the one that creates the Sulphur-Mercury Theory, where sulfur and mercury are then understood as principles within alchemy. Remember then, sulfur is a stone, and it's a stone which itself is capable of bursting into flames. It's a burning stone. So it becomes the image for the dry and the hot principle. Classically, it was called brimstone, and so fire in brimstone, it is the burning stone. Opposite to that is mercury, and mercury being unique because it's a metal, but it's liquid, and at room temperature it stays in a liquid state. And it shows you the cold, moist principle in alchemy. So Jabir, who is probably an actual historical person, an alchemist, but was also a name under which many, many alchemists wrote during the Arab period. And there's hundreds of writings attributed to this Jabir, which then got translated in the medieval period into Latin, where he became Jaber or Geber, and more writings were attributed to him in the Latin period. So we've got all of these writings from Jabir or Geber, but probably there was this Jabir ibn Hayyan, who definitely wrote about a sulphur-mercury theory. And as you can see, what he writes in the Book of Explanations is that the metals are all, in essence, composed of mercury combined and coagulated with sulfur. And so the metals from lead, tin, copper, and iron to silver and gold have increasingly balanced and perfect proportions of sulfur and mercury. So now sulfur and mercury are being used as principles, and to distinguish it as a principle, he calls it sophic or philosophic sulfur and philosophic mercury, as opposed to the vulgar substances. Jaber then goes on to use the Arabic language and all the various linguistic constructions of these names to decide on what the proportions are for all the different combinations of mercury, and sulfur to create first lead, then tin, then copper, all the way up to silver and gold. If you understand sulfur and mercury as principles in alchemy, and here you see the symbol for sulfur on the left, the triangle with the cross underneath, indicating that fire is important within sulfur. And there on the right you see the mercury principle with the symbol of mercury. Then you have a series of binary oppositions, and water, fire being one principal opposition between them, also fire being hot and dry, whereas water being cold and moist, but also the dry exhalation against the moist vapor. So air is then compared to fire, since they're both subtle, water with earth because they're both dense. In a certain sense, fire is the active principle, whereas water is the passive principle. Fire being more like form, in the sense that form itself is invisible. Form is this invisible structure that is imposed on matter. This is Aristotle's idea. And so matter then being, again, a feminine principle, the materia, and form being the male principle, that which gives structure to matter. The sulfur principle, again, is fixed, whereas mercury is volatile. It's always moving. Mercury never stays put. Wherever you put it, it's a volatile substance. And so, from there, the masculine and feminine. And this masculine-feminine division gets expanded again in alchemy. Examples of the masculine and feminine principles in alchemy are given time and again. This central image here is from the Rosarium Philosophorum, and there you get Sol and Luna as the two principal characters, Sol being sun and Luna being moon. And as you can see, he is standing on the sun, she is standing on the moon. He has a crown, she has a crown, so he is the king and she is the queen. Now, since Gnosticism was a fundamental influence on alchemy, Christ is therefore the king. Christ is the male or masculine principle, and his counterbalance in Gnosticism is Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. So, although it's never explicit in alchemy, she, in a certain sense, is Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, just as he is the Christ. And certainly by the end of the Rosarium Philosophorum, we do see Christ emerging from the tomb, for example, in that text. The king is gold, the queen is silver, and so the final two steps of the opus, going from the white stage, the albedo, which is associated with the silver, to the red stage, the rubedo, which is associated with the gold. And so typically you have to reach the silver stage before the final gold stage. Masculine principle, again, is spirit. Spirit being very connected to pneuma in ancient Greek, also mind, nous in ancient Greek, so the upper part, whereas soul being closely connected to anima or psyche, which is closer to the heart, the emotional body in the human being, and therefore feminine. Last of all, semen and menstrual blood, this Aristotelian idea that to create a child, the male contributes the form through the semen, and the woman contributes the matter through the menstrual blood, and those combined create the child. So moving on from the masculine and feminine principles to the stages of the opus, we discover that there are not necessarily only 3 or only 4, but there can be as many as 5, sometimes 7, sometimes even 12 stages to the opus. Typically, though, in the beginning, when we look at the Egyptian and Greek period, there were commonly 3 stages, and they were described in Greek as the melanosis, the leucosis, and the iosis, which is then translated into Latin as the nigredo, albedo, and rubedo. So the opus moves from the blackening to the whitening to the reddening stages. And that is to say that whatever is in the vessel is first probably burned or calcined to its most basic primordial state. And then through a process of perhaps distillation, it's reanimated, and that becomes the white stage. And finally, there's a transformation that occurs, a transmutation into the red, the rubido, which is the final stage of the opus. We see this, for example, when we're treating cinnabar and trying to take this cinnabar, which is actually a combination of sulfur and mercury, and transform those into what becomes the pigment vermilion. And vermilion is a red pigment, but first it has to go through this blackening of metacinnabar and then this whitening stage before it becomes red. So these three stages are actually based on certain alchemical processes that were used in ancient times, and then it got expanded into the 4 stages. The 4 stages being now the melanosis, leucosis, xanthosis, and iosis. So they've added this middle stage of the xanthosis, or citronitis in Latin, which is to say the yellowing. And certain thinkers like Empedocles or Plato describe the importance of the yellowing which occurs as one of the 4 elements. And so the 4 colors are therefore associated with the 4 elements. Then the cauda pavonis, which is to say the peacock's tail, starts to occur in various alchemical texts, one example being the Splendor Solis series. And here at the far right, you even have 5 stages. The 5 stages going from the black crow, which is to say the crow being symbolic of the black or nigredo, the white swan, the peacock, which is all the colors, the pelican, and then the red phoenix. Here you can see that the alchemical opus doesn't have 3, 4, or 5, but 7 stages. And we looked at this text already, this image of the 7 stages of the opus related to the 7 planets at the top. Again, you can have this kind of pyramid-like structure, a step pyramid with Sol and Luna at the very top, or as you see in this case over here, the various stages leading up to, at the very top, lapis, and lapis being the stone, the philosopher's stone, as a result of those 7 steps. So whether they used calcination or sublimation or solution, it varied from alchemist to alchemist, and each one had their own series of steps and methods to arrive at the philosopher's stone. I would like to stop and look for a moment at the process of distillation, because that was very important, especially for the early alchemists. Recall that distillation really occurred. The first ambics, or that's the Greek word, or alembic, the first distillation device occurred around the time of Zosimos in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And for them, it was an amazing instrument, and it took on various philosophical and allegorical qualities. Also, for the first time, copper distillation devices were being replaced with glass ones, and so they were able to see what was going on inside. So in any distillation device, you have this bottom part, which is heated, and that is called the cucurbits, or just basically a flask. And on top of that, you have the alembic, or as I said, ambics, and it is the condenser, the place where that which is heated will condense. Then the condensed liquid goes down this tube and is received in the receiving flask. So how do we view this from an allegorical point of view? That from the allegorical point of view, then, the cucurbits, or the vessel at the bottom, is actually the male principle. And so here it is heated by fire, and as a result, the substance within rises up, and then it is held within this womb-like structure, which is the feminine principle. And often alchemists would put like a water bath or something around the top part, so the cooling would happen. And with the cooling came the condensation. And this condensation then was the feminine principle uniting with the masculine principle, and together those two would descend, and the combination of the masculine and feminine created either the hermaphrodite, which is to say male, female as one, or the child. And the child is, in a certain sense, a hermaphrodite, because they don't really have any gender expression until a little bit later in life. So in this distillation device, you have the union of the masculine and the feminine symbolized through this alchemical instrument. Here are a series of images from the Rosarium Philosophorum, and you can see more of the allegorical processes that typically take place in the alchemical opus. Conjunction being one, Sol and Luna, he who stands on the sun, she who stands on the moon. In the earlier illustration, they were clothed as the king and the queen. Here, they are removed of their clothes, and they come together in the bath with this Holy Spirit between them, each holding the other's flower. Finally, they come together in sexual union, and as a result of their sexual union, they actually die, but then when they are reborn, they're reborn as the hermaphrodite. So you have both conjunction of two into one and the process of death and rebirth happening all within the Rosarium Philosophorum. And you can see how this relates to processes of distillation or other alchemical processes allegorized. The influence of the 7 planets on the opus was fundamental. This is part of the relationship of theurgy to alchemy, and we'll learn more about that, as well as astrology to alchemy, which is an important part of Hermeticism. So each of the 7 metals has a relationship to the 7 planets, and the planets themselves are constantly influencing what's going on inside the alchemical vessel. You see on the far right, you are a chemical vessel with the different distribution of the planets and their positions in the heavens influencing what's happening in your vessel. And here in the middle, you have this Saturnine-like old man with the black crow on his chest, so symbolic of the Nigredo, the black stage, the death stage. And Saturn, the black star, is having the greatest influence on this stage of the opus, with the sun and the moon on either side, and the winds, the fire, the air, the water, all symbolized in as part of the effects on transpiring within the alchemical vessel. In this diagram here on the left, you can see again the symbols of Mercury and Sulphur, and these are being influenced by the sun and the moon as well as the 7 planets. And you also have the pillars of the Kabbalah on the left and the right, as well as the symbols of earth, air, fire, and water at the tops and the bottoms of the columns. So all of these cosmic influences coming together and transpiring within the alchemical opus, the influence of the 7 planets. What is the correspondence of the metals to the planets? Well, let's begin at the bottom. And the heaviest and dullest of all the metals is lead. So it is then influenced or has a correspondence to Saturn. And here's the symbol for both Saturn and lead. From the Saturn-lead correspondence, we move to the Jupiter-tin correspondence, Jupiter being related to the metal tin, though it's true that in earlier periods of alchemy, it was actually electrum, which is to say a alloy of gold and silver that was associated with Jupiter, but then it became tin. Mars, clearly associated with iron, the metal of warriors and swords. Venus related to copper, copper being a warm, soft substance, very gold-like. Mercury being related to the planet Mercury. Sometimes the substance Mercury was called quicksilver to distinguish it from the planet Mercury. Silver being related to the moon, and gold being related to the sun. Notice in this alchemical order of planets that we're starting with Saturn and moving this way. In the Ptolemaic cosmos, which we'll see later on, the sun actually occurs between Venus and Mars, but here the sun is paired with the moon at the top. And we're moving in a certain sense from lead to tin to iron to copper to mercury to silver to gold, this being a progress from the most base to the most noble of metals. And so from this outermost planet through to the innermost and then to the sun at the end. So here is the Ptolemaic model of the cosmos. As we will see, the sun appears between Venus and Mars, but before we get there, Let's start at the bottom with the sphere of the Earth, and you have to imagine that Earth and water are the densest of the spheres and come together and form a sphere. And then air becomes another sphere surrounding water and Earth. And then above air was what is imagined as this fiery sphere. Invisible, though, an invisible fire. Above that was the sphere of ether, and so there are actually 5 elements, not just 4, between the moon and fire, and it was Aristotle who suggested this ether sphere. And then after the sublunar realm comes the realm of the 7 visible planets, Moon being the closest to us, then followed by Mercury, Venus, and for Ptolemy, Sun came next, followed by Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, later we will realize that the Sun is actually at the center and that Earth is actually positioned here between Venus and Mars. But during the Greek period and during Ptolemy, it was understood that the Earth was at the center and Venus and the Sun and Mars, the Sun appearing here, which is certainly understandable from an Earth-based perspective, which is what they had. So that then becomes the 12 spheres within spheres, and you can even imagine that in this larger sphere of the moon, it is an invisible sphere in which there is like this doorway of light that is the moon, and we could pass through the moon as if through a doorway to the next sphere, this invisible sphere of Mercury with only one little spot of light, and that is another doorway. And so you have all these spheres within spheres turning in different all in the same direction, but at different speeds, and that the soul itself could pass through door after door after door to both enter into the body at birth and leave the body after death through these cosmic framework. Above that structure of 12, which is to say 7 planets and 5 elements, the 12, is another higher sphere which also consists of 12. And the 12 in this case will be the 9 orders of angels plus the Trinity. The 9 orders of angels, this comes to us from a Neoplatonic Christian philosopher named Pseudo-Dionysius, because it was not actually Dionysius who wrote it, but someone who wrote in his name. And from Pseudo-Dionysius, we have this order of 9 angels, beginning with the angels at the bottom, then the archangels and principalities, and these form a certain trinity of the most active ones. Then the middle ones, the powers, virtues, and dominions. And at the top, the thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. These are more meditative than active. These are turning the gaze of the divine back to itself and singing its praises and giving it images of itself. Whereas these ones turn towards humanity, and this is why the archangels and the angels interact with humanity. So 9 orders of angels. And why 9? 9 reduces down to 3 times 3. So a trinity of trinities, 9 orders of angels, and above them, the Trinity itself. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, Pater Filius and Spiritus Sanctus. Here, beautifully represented as one head with 3 faces, or one head facing in 3 directions. So the Trinity is always understood in Christianity as one, and the concept of the Trinity emerged in the same period as Alexandrian Neoplatonism, where they saw divinity as a oneness, that this was very important at that time. So here's the whole picture then. You have these 12 spheres within spheres at the bottom, which then get mirrored by the 12 circles at the top. These ones being 5 elements and 7 planets, these ones being 9 angels and the Trinity at the center, the mirrored cosmos, as it was called. Which brings us to the image of man, and for alchemy, man was a microcosm. Man had contained within himself all of the elements and the influence of the planets. And this is what Robert Flood is trying to show us in this diagram, that man himself is the microcosmos, and as the microcosm, he reflects the macrocosm. So the planets that you see over here are reflected in man and influence everything that he does. Another important alchemical concept that we'll meet with again and again is this division of the human being into this three-part structure of spirit, soul, and body. Body being the corpus, or soma in Greek, and then the soul being the animus or psyche in Greek, and finally the spirit, pneuma in Greek or spiritus in Latin. So you see, for example, in this alchemical diagram, which is an amazing mandala, we'll meet with it again, that you have an inverted triangle and you have anima, corpus, spiritus as the three corners that symbolize the alchemist himself at the center. Those are the three constituents of the alchemist. In this image over here, corpus lies at the bottom, and then above corpus, rising up, is the anima, so from body to soul, and then spirit from above comes down to embrace soul or anima. So this is humanity. Humanity has a three-part structure of body, soul, and spirit. Soul being understood in the ancient Greek sense as the emotional body. It was eternal, but it was considered to be the middle ground between spirit and body. Spirit being the highest part of the human being because it is mind, and mind being related to God, whereas soul being the intermediary and being the emotional body because soul is constantly influenced by the needs of the body, by desire, by hunger, by exhaustion, and so on. And so spirit must master body through soul, through the intermediary of soul. And it's really in soul that this battle takes place between spirit and body. Finally, the body will perish. Even in some beliefs, such as Gnosticism, the soul will perish and only the spirit will survive as this reflection or particle of divinity. So what happens at the end of the opus? At the end of the opus, the alchemist hopes to achieve the philosopher's stone. And it was also called the tincture, or gold. And tincture is used in the language of dyeing, that if you have a certain color, you are able to put this in a liquid, and anything which you dip in the liquid will absorb that color. And so that is the dye, the tincture. And in a certain sense, the philosopher's stone had that function. Anything that it touched would change. And the image of baptism is also very important here, because when you enter the water, you change color when you are dyed. And so the tincture had the property of baptizing, of changing, of spiritualizing that which it touched. And so that's the nature of the philosopher's stone. It makes something more spiritual, it makes something more noble. On the other hand, achieving the philosopher's stone, achieving that state of oneness with the all, was very difficult, and so it becomes a mystery. It is symbolized geometrically by the squared circle, and you often see a combination of a triangle, a square, and a circle in alchemy, not just here, for example, but at the bottom over here of this image, you have the 4, the 3, the 2, and the 1 all imagined as a square, as a triangle, as a line, and as a point. The hermaphrodite being another important image of the philosopher's stone, or the end of the opus. And so this combination of the male and the female. In this particular diagram, it is a re bis, which is Latin for a combined thing. Re being an object or a thing, bis being bina, combined, a res bina. So the male and the female are combined. Interestingly, this particular hermaphrodite holds the set square and the compass in its hands, which are symbolic of all the operations in geometry. And you do see these geometrical elements here at the bottom. Standing upon this Prima Materia, or beast, this primordial source of the Opus, and having mastered it, having it become the master. Here again, a similar image from another text, and now this is more like an egg-like structure, or the sphere of the world. And the last one on the right being from the Rosarium Philosophorum. Text to describe the Philosopher's Stone, then, the end of the Opus. Even here on the left, it is familiar to all men, both young and old. It is found in the village, the country, and in the town, in all things created by God, yet it is despised by all. Rich and poor handle it every day. It is cast into the streets by servant maids. Children play with it. So it's this mysterious substance which exists everywhere and nowhere. George Ripley describes the Philosopher's Stone saying, "Each man possesses it. It is everywhere, in you, in me, in all things, in time and in space." And finally, Zosimos describes it as this stone which is not a stone, a precious thing which has no value, a thing of many shapes which has no shape, the unknown which is known to all. And I think that fundamentally describes the Philosopher's Stone not necessarily as an object, a physical object, but rather as something immaterial, and therefore as a kind of a state of mind. And the state of mind being the squared circle, the understanding of how the four come to one, and that the many indeed are unified with the one in the all. So I would like to conclude this presentation with some examples of alchemy. And this one, the emerald tablet, which emerged during the Arabic period of alchemy, perhaps is the greatest summary. It's been interpreted many times because, for example, it has 7 paragraphs, a 7-part structure, and each part of it might refer to a step of the opus. It is pure alchemical poetry, and it has some of the most well-known alchemical expressions. I'll read it then. It begins, "In truth, without deceit, certain and most veritable, that which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing. And just as all things have come from this one thing through the meditation of one mind, so do all created things originate from the one thing through transformation. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. It is the origin of all, the consecration of the universe. Its inherent strength is perfected if it is turned into earth. Separate the earth from fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. It rises from earth to heaven and descends again to earth, thereby combining within itself the powers of both the above and the below. Thus will you obtain the glory of the whole universe. All obscurity will be clear to you. This is the greatest force of all powers, because it overcomes every subtle things and penetrates every solid thing. In this way was the universe created. From this comes many wondrous applications, because this is the pattern. Therefore, am I called thrice greatest Hermes, having all 3 parts of the wisdom of the whole universe? Herein have I completely explained the operation of the sun. As you can see, pure poetry, allegorical, open to many interpretations, and yet the essence of it somehow is clear, that there is a mysterious process going on, and this mysterious process is going to finally result in a certain moment of understanding and revelation. So hence the emerald tablet. I would like to show you some images now. So this is the frontispiece to the Basilica Philosophica by Milius, Johann Daniel Milius, and it is perhaps the greatest alchemical mandala that was ever created. It gives you an idea of alchemy during the High Renaissance, when engraving was at its height. It is a huge allegory of alchemy, describing that which is above is the same as that which is below, and how the day world and the night world may be divided into the masculine and the feminine. So we're going to look at this and take it apart bit by bit. But first, I would like to give credit to the man who engraved it. His name is Matthias Merian, and he himself was responsible for many engravings, particularly those which were written by Milius. And this is an image of Merian himself. And you can see that he has his particular engraving style, which then appears in some of the most important alchemical texts. So, returning then to the Basilica Philosophica, we have the as above here and the so below here. And then this male figure who is part of the day world, which we can see clearly through the sky, whereas the woman on the right is part of the night world, the darkness. And we're going to see how these two, from left and right, find their union in the center figure of the alchemist here. And that this is indeed a path to be followed higher and higher through the cosmos and through the steps of the opus to the upper world. Beginning then with the left and the right, we see that he himself is holding the sun in his hand, whereas she is holding the moon, even though they both have a sun, moon, and star on their bodies. So he is Saul, upholding the sun, and he is aided by the lion, which we see here, lion being the symbol of sulfur. She then is Luna, and she is upholding the moon, aided by the stag with a clover. And the stag is not a very common image of Mercury, but does appear in certain alchemical texts as Cervus fugitivus, in the same way that the stag is in the forest and difficult to track down, a fugitive running. Mercury has that same quality of being evasive and running and fleeing. So he stands upon a bird, and that bird is the phoenix, which is embracing worlds of fire and of air. And so these being then described as masculine elements, and the phoenix being the bird to embrace those. By contrast, she stands upon the eagle, Aquila, and that bird is embracing water and earth, spheres of water and earth, so that she is the feminine aspect of these two lower or more dense elements, the water and the earth. The task then is to bring these together. Notice that they are both chained to the higher structure, which is the cosmos itself, so that these are the influences of the planets and so on the elements and the sulfur and mercury as principles. And here in the middle stands the alchemist. And the alchemist, it's difficult to see, but is holding two axes. And with these axes, he has managed to free himself of the chains that are binding the male and the female on either side. And he unites their masculine and feminine natures in himself. He is both the day world, we see in his robe of day, and the night world with his robe of night. And here two beasts, in this case two lions, combine into one beast in the center that is flowing out. So again, a res bina, a combined thing. In this case, it is the red lion of sulfur and the green lion of mercury, which come together and flow as one. Now you have a whole forest of allegorical plants and trees, of which the clearest ones would be the metals associated with the planets. And we saw Saturn, lead, and then that's their symbol over here. And Jupiter in tin with their symbol over here in this tree. Mars and iron with that symbol, the sun at the very top, and then we move to Venus and copper, Mercury, which is quicksilver, and the moon, which is silver on the other side. So the planets and the metals. But there's more symbols, and alchemists had many symbols for the many different metals and stones that they were using. And for us as artists, it's very interesting to see some of them and read them. So here, salt, the symbol of salt, which as we saw in Paracelsus and the Tria Prima, salt, mercury, and sulfur formed the three fundamental substances or principles in the Opus. And these can then be related to spirit, soul, and body in the alchemist himself. Alum is very important in the dyeing process, and when you are dyeing, you need an alum in order to complete the tincture. Here is the symbol of tartar and sal ammoniac, which are basic forms of acids or vinegars in the alchemical opus. And here, sulfur. So opposite mercury over there is the sulfur tree. The remaining plants are interesting for us as artists because all these plants or substances have to do with artists' pigments. And this begins with the red iron oxide over here called Crocus Mars by the alchemists. And we find red iron oxide in the ochres and the umbers and the siennas, all of the earth tones used by artists. Orepigment, which is commonly known as orpiment, was a yellow powder or a yellow pigment that was used all throughout history until in the 1700s and 1800s new yellows were synthesized. Verdigris, which comes from copper, the green rust of copper, is basically a green pigment and was used by artists to create their greens. And cinnabar that you see over here is, again, a very important red pigment that was used throughout history and is actually created through mercury and sulfur in combination. So in this part of the diagram, you have not just the metals, but also the other substances which were actually used by artists within their paintings. As we rise to the top of this image, we pass through, we've seen this before, 5 stages of the alchemical opus, and these 5 stages are symbolized by 5 birds, in this case, the black crow, the white swan, what's called the green dragon here, the white pelican, and the red phoenix. So black, white, and then middle stages, green, and then the multiplication through the pelican, and finally the red phoenix at the end. These lead inward, and they lead inward to this middlemost circle. We see symbols of the 5 planets and 12 constellations. Here, the 5 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, as well as the 12 signs of the zodiac at the top. And then, strangely, year of the wind, year of the sun, year of the stars. That's what's written in these inner circles here. As well as then at the center, Mercury, with the upper triangle of fire and the lower triangle of water combined in the symbol at the bottom. It's written in one of the circles here then, you must find the 4 grades of fire for the work. So again, this idea of the 4 grades of fire to complete the opus. And you have the classic image of the Trinity, the Father, the Son in the form of the Lamb, and the Holy Spirit, with their leagues of angels symbolizing this upper world that the alchemist is trying to achieve. The Trinity, the 3 as one, the 3 coming together as one. And in this case, the 3 may very well be mercury, sulfur, and salt, or some combination that become one in mercury. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the kind of allegories and images and so forth that we use in alchemy. And as I said, this is just an introductory lecture, but I was hoping to show you some of the most basic ideas and concepts, and we'll go much deeper in the subsequent lectures until we finally come to painting itself and the processes of painting in relationship to alchemy. So thank you for your attention, thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking again in our next lecture. Thank you.